In this episode, we will dive into a dark narrative that will lead us into a true earthly hell, exploring the disturbing details of a unique family, unlike anything ever recorded in our history. If you enjoy hearing about historical crimes, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, leaving your comments. In the final days of 1870, two individuals, father and son, named John Bender and John Bender Jr., embarked on a journey to Osage County, located in Kansas, in search of land where they could establish a new beginning. The region was still expanding, filled with vast plains and opportunities for brave pioneers willing to face the challenges of the American West. After spending the night in the area, they were taken by a man named Ern Brookman to examine the available properties. Historical documents show that John Bender selected a 160-acre property located in the northeastern part of an area known as Section 13 in Osage County. Interestingly, this decision placed him near Ern's land, which was located in the southeastern part of the same section. Additionally, John Bender Jr. acquired land in Section 12, remaining geographically close to both his father and Ern. This territorial arrangement appears to have been a calculated strategy to prevent other settlers from approaching, establishing a distance that would later reveal sinister intentions. The majority of these properties remained undeveloped, except for a strip adjacent to the main road, where they concentrated their operations. Later, they purchased several stones from their new neighbor, Mr. Hieronymus. These stones would be used to pave the cellar that would be built, as well as a well they also constructed using the material. At another point, they brought hay to the newly erected storage building, and then wood was brought from Fort Scott, located 78 miles northeast, for the future Bender Inn. In the fall of 1871, when everything was nearly finished, the two men sent a letter to Marley and Kate Bender asking them to take the train and come live in their new home. In the spring of 1872, the lands of Kansas received thousands of immigrant families, and among them were the Bender women. At first glance, they did not seem extraordinary, just another family reuniting in search of peace and a future in the American lands. They simply appeared to be seeking the prosperity promised in the Wild West. But what no one could have imagined is that the goals and the methods by which they would obtain their wealth would be, at the very least, terrifying. The Bender home was located between the towns of Thayer and Galesburg in Neosho County. On the property there was a general store in the back, and near the road, they built what appeared to be an inn for travelers, basically a cabin split in half by a canvas curtain. Behind the curtain were two rooms, and anyone who decided to spend the night there would have to settle in a tight space near the couple's bed. Next to Marley and John's bed, there was a trapdoor that led to the cellar. At the back, there was also an orchard and a small garden. Over time, animals were acquired, but they were not healthy or robust as one might expect. They eventually suffered from lack of food and became skeletal and dehydrated. Old John Bender was approximately 60 years old and barely communicated in English. When he attempted to speak, it was hardly understandable. His wife, Marley Bender, 42, was a bitter woman, incapable of kindness, and quickly earned the nickname Demon from neighbors and travelers who often passed by the Bender residence. John Bender Jr., 25 years old, was described as a young man with red hair and mustache who spoke fluent English but with a German accent. His only peculiarity was that he would laugh at anything, even alone. Many began to consider him mentally disturbed. But the star of the Bender family was the youngest daughter, Kate Bender, 23 years old, a well-educated and attractive young woman who spoke nearly perfect English without an accent. She proclaimed herself a spiritual medium and healer. Kate often held spiritual sessions at the inn, and soon neighbors and men from town began to visit frequently, many motivated solely by the young woman's beauty. However, many independent-minded women with progressive views often visited the house to talk with Kate, who preached free love and held an unconventional, non-conservative worldview. The young woman's popularity became a major attraction for the inn, and the family began planning ways to make this bring them even more profit. John Jr. and Kate Bender attended the Harmony Grove Sunday School, where they managed to earn great respect from their neighbors. Kate also worked as a waitress at a hotel in Cherryvale, where she received generous tips due to her kindness. The origins of the Bender family gradually began to unravel. As far as is known, Marley Bender's real name was Elmira Meek. In the past, she had lived in the Adirondack Mountains to the north, where she married George Griffin and had 12 children. Marley had several husbands throughout her life, but the last one supposedly died from a severe head injury. Kate Bender was her fifth child from her last marriage, and her real name was Eliza Griffith. She allegedly married and changed her name to Sarah Eliza Davis before finally becoming known as Kate Bender. John Bender Jr. was born as John Gebhardt. Many neighbors reported that Kate was actually his wife, meaning that in truth they were not siblings at all. Old John Bender was once known as John Flickinger, and his origin remains uncertain. Some sources say he was born in Germany, others in the Netherlands. The fact is that the entire Bender family may actually have been nothing more than a group of outlaws, and the family business was merely a facade, something we will understand more clearly ahead. The Bender family devised a way to profit even more than they already did from the inn and from Kate's fame. They began to target wealthy travelers, offering them a free dinner or a complimentary spiritual session. Kate lured them into sitting in what was considered the seat of honor at the dinner table, where they also had a clear view of Kate performing her spiritual work. Due to the family's charisma and popularity, the travelers felt delighted to be treated this way. But it was at that moment that old John Bender would emerge from behind the curtain with a hammer and strike the travelers violently on the head, sometimes killing them instantly. The body was carried to the cellar where the victim was stripped and left. Many who did not die instantly from the blow tried in vain to fight back and draw their weapons, firing shots into the ceiling and walls of the cellar before being struck again. Usually after the body was thrown into the cellar, the one who finished the job was Kate, who slit the men's throats so that their bodies could later be buried in the orchard area behind the property. The plan worked for more than a year. The family was making an unbelievable fortune while also profiting from the spiritual sessions and from hosting less wealthy travelers. John Jr. stayed near the road where, with all his eccentric behavior, he managed to lure rich and weary travelers into staying at the inn. And if he couldn't convince them, Kate's beauty and refined manners would. In 1872, a large number of hungry travelers stopped at the Bender Inn seeking a safe night's rest. Kate also offered provisions. These were violent times, and the disappearances took a long time to draw attention. Many of the travelers were complete strangers to the area and had never been seen before. The people of Cherryvale didn't pay much attention to who entered or left the town. They were just travelers passing through. Many of them were wealthy and arrogant. One night, a young man approached Kate while she was on the porch and was persuaded by her to stay for dinner. He was placed in the seat of honor, and after a long conversation, 2 other men arrived and were also welcomed with dinner at the table. The 2 men did not stay the night. After paying for their meal, they continued on their journey. But the first man stayed and booked a room for the night. Before going to sleep, however, he asked that a letter be sent to notify his family that he would be home the following day. Kate was not pleased with the request and tried to convince him not to send the letter, but the man insisted and went to bed. During the early hours of the morning, the man woke up to loud noises and violent thuds. At the foot of his bed stood Kate, who seemed to be waiting for him to wake up. Afraid, he closed his eyes and tried to sleep again, praying that nothing bad would happen. However, whispers and groans continued to echo throughout the house, apparently coming from the cellar. The next morning, when he questioned Kate about the sounds, she gave an indifferent explanation. It was just a noisy pig in the cellar. Suspicious, the traveler continued his journey, and years later, upon learning the whole truth about the Bender Inn, he finally understood the danger he had been in that night. In the winter of 1872, a man named George Launcher, after the funeral of his wife, set out with his daughter toward Independence. During the trip, they passed along the road where the Bender Inn was located, and after that day, they were never seen again. Almost a year later, in the spring of 1873, a close neighbor of George, Dr. William York, decided to ride to Independence to look for him. Having received no news from his friend for months, he found the disappearance suspicious as no letters had arrived. Along the way, William questioned local residents about George and his daughter, but no one could give any information about their whereabouts. After a long journey, he stopped and stayed at the Bender Inn.
Without needing much persuasion, he quickly became enchanted by Kate's beauty and charisma. The next morning, he continued on to Fort Scott, where he met his brother, Colonel York. During their conversation, he mentioned that he planned to spend another night at the Bender family inn before continuing his journey. On March 9th, William decided to return to the place. Sensing that something strange was in the air, unusual events began occurring around the same time at the Bender Inn. Guests began fleeing from the dinner table after complaining about noises coming from behind the curtain, interruptions that spoiled the family's attacks. Many managed to escape simply because they were paying attention. Although the Benders murdered their guests, they needed to act discreetly and avoid creating a scandal. An alert young man could easily react, putting the entire family at risk. Therefore, choosing the right victims was essential for them. During one of Kate's spiritual sessions, a client became so frightened by the noises and alleged supernatural manifestations that he ran out of the inn. It is believed that these paranormal events were staged by the family themselves, making the atmosphere more realistic and terrifying. And certainly, none of those clients knew that far worse things than paranormal activity were taking place in that inn. After noticing that his brother, Dr. William York, never returned home, Colonel York organized a search, gathering more than 50 men. All known and unknown travelers in the region were questioned, and every property along the route was inspected. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York finally arrived at the Benders Inn, accompanied by Officer Mr. Johnson. He explained that he was looking for his missing brother and asked the family if they had seen anything suspicious. Deep down, he strongly suspected the Benders. The family admitted that William had stayed at the inn, but said he left the following day. They also suggested that he might have been attacked by Native Americans in the area. At that time, almost everything was blamed on the natives, and prejudice caused them to be seen as guilty of any crime. However, Colonel York was not fooled. The search for his brother was far from over. Colonel York was not convinced by the Native American explanation. He knew that the natives in the region would not attack someone like his brother, but to maintain appearances, he agreed that the possibility should be considered. He then decided to stay for dinner with the family. Whether he suspected that he might be sitting in the very place where his brother had been murdered, we will never know. The next morning, he left, and the searches continued for several days, but without success. However, on April 3, 1873, Colonel York returned to the inn, this time accompanied by armed officers. The decision was made after receiving a report from a woman who claimed she had been threatened with a knife by Marley Bender at the location. Marley pretended not to understand the accusations made by the men, but after the reason for the visit was repeated several times, she became furious. She called the woman a lying witch and ordered everyone to leave her residence. At that moment, it became evident that she spoke English fluently, something she had always denied. Colonel York realized he would need more concrete evidence to arrest Marley, so he decided to leave. But before the man departed, Kate insisted that he return alone, assuring him she would use her clairvoyant abilities to find her brother. Meanwhile, the officers accompanying York were convinced of the Benders' guilt and wanted to hang them immediately. However, the colonel insisted that solid proof was necessary before any punishment could be carried out. Shortly afterward, neighboring communities began to suspect that the residents of Osage were involved in the disappearances. The fact that many of the victims were important and wealthy people raised even more suspicion. In response, a meeting was organized, bringing together 75 residents, including Colonel York and the elder Benders. During the discussion, the disappearances were addressed, and it was decided that all properties between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek would be inspected. This included the Bender family's land, which left them visibly uncomfortable. However, during the search period, no one noticed any unusual movement at the inn, and when they finally realized something was wrong, it was already too late. 3 days after the meeting, Billy Toll, a neighbor of the family, noticed that the inn was empty and abandoned. While driving his cattle, he saw that the animals on the farm had been without food for at least a day. Worried, he reported the situation to Leroy Dick, the city administrator. However, only a few days later was Leroy able to gather officers and volunteers, including Colonel York, to investigate the inn. When they arrived, they found the house completely empty. No food, clothes, or personal belongings had been left behind. But then a strong, unpleasant smell began to come from beneath one of the beds. After pushing it aside, the men found a trapdoor sealed with nails. After great effort, they finally managed to open it and climb down. In the underground space, a large pool of coagulated blood covered the floor. Colonel York ordered the ground to be broken in hopes of finding buried bodies, but nothing was hidden there. Everyone knew that the blood was most likely human, and the search intensified around the inn. During the night, the first body was found near the orchard, and unfortunately, it was Dr. William York. The investigations continued until midnight, and 9 graves were marked for excavation the following morning. The next day, to the surprise of no one, 9 bodies were found in 8 of the graves. Throughout the day, new excavations were carried out, and more human remains were discovered. Only one of the bodies did not have its head smashed by a heavy object. Analysis revealed that all the victims had been brutally murdered. The blows to the head, likely inflicted with a hammer, were always accompanied by deep cuts to the throat. In addition, many of the bodies were mutilated, further emphasizing the cruelty of the killings. Among the bodies found, one stood out, that of a girl who showed injuries severe enough to cause her death. However, no one could determine whether she had been strangled to death or buried alive while succumbing. Shortly afterward, a Kansas newspaper reported that the Bender family's neighbors, outraged and enraged, had lynched one of the family's close friends, known as Brockman. He was hung from a beam and repeatedly hanged while being interrogated about the Benders' whereabouts. However, he maintained his story, insisting he knew nothing, and was therefore released. Investigations continued, and a few weeks later a man named Edson Roach and his son-in-law William Buxton were arrested on charges of being accomplices to the family. In total, 12 people were detained, accused of having knowledge of the criminal activities at the inn and failing to report them to the local authorities. Additionally, some were suspected of helping the family get rid of the victims' belongings by selling the stolen items. Among those arrested, one member of the Vigilance Committee was accused of forging a letter in which one of the victims supposedly informed his wife that he had arrived safely at his destination in Abilene. The Bender family's escape quickly became one of the most famous criminal cases in Kansas history. The press exploited the story, and newspapers featured the headline, "Bloody Benders." The inn was invaded by hundreds of onlookers and photographers, which forced the police to act in order to control the crowd. Meanwhile, organized groups sought revenge, and the entire state of Kansas was searched. However, the family had completely vanished. The searches continued for weeks, but no trace was ever found. Experienced detectives followed the tracks left by a wagon, and on the outskirts of the town of Thayer, about 12 miles north of the inn, they found the family's wagon abandoned. The horses were starving and dehydrated, indicating that they had been left behind for some time. Investigations confirmed that in Thayer, the family bought train tickets at the Leavenworth railway station bound for Humboldt. They then traveled to Chanute, where John Jr. and Kate took another train heading south, disembarking in Red River County, near Denison, Texas. After arriving in Texas, the Benders traveled to an outlaw colony located between Texas and New Mexico. However, from that point on, they were no longer pursued. Later, a detective claimed to have followed the family's trail to the border and discovered that John Jr. had died of apoplexy, a condition known today simply as a stroke. John and Marley Bender continued their journey to St. Louis, Missouri, where they were never seen again. With the lack of leads, Alexander York, brother of William York, offered a $1,000 reward for the family's capture. On May 17, 1873, Governor Thomas Osborne increased the reward to $2,000. In total, a $3,000 reward was offered for the capture of the Benders. By this point, legends began to spread throughout Kansas, fueling theories about the family's whereabouts. Some vigilante groups claimed to have captured and executed the Benders, saying that John Jr. and Marley had been shot to death, while Kate was burned alive. Others alleged that their bodies had been thrown into the Verdigris River, while a third group claimed to have confronted the Benders and buried their bodies in an open field in Kansas.
For decades, the story of the Benders' escape remained alive in Kansas folklore. Even 50 years later, ordinary people were still hunting for the family. Many times, two women traveling together were accused of being Kate and Marley Bender. Until, in 1884, a rumor began to circulate that John Bender, also known as John Flickinger, had committed suicide in Lake Michigan. The story of the Bender family quickly spread throughout Kansas, reaching cities like New York and Chicago. The case drew thousands of curious people and reporters, bringing more than 3,000 visitors to the crime scene in an attempt to uncover more details about the inn and the murders. In 1886, the Bender Inn was completely destroyed by treasure hunters who took everything they could find, including the stones that lined the basement and the well. On October 31, 1889, new information came to light. A report claimed that two women, Elmira Monroe and Eliza Davis, had been arrested in Niles, Michigan, after witnesses alleged that the two were actually Kate and Marley Bender. During questioning, Eliza Davis supposedly signed a statement admitting that Elmira Monroe was, in fact, Marley Bender. The two women were sent to Oswego, Kansas, for a formal trial. The hearing was initially scheduled for February 1890, but was eventually postponed to May of the same year. According to records, the county refused to pay the expenses of keeping the women in jail for 3 months, and they were released. Another version suggests that the two women were mistaken, as while some witnesses claimed to recognize them as the real Benders, others could not identify them. With so many uncertainties and contradictions, the trial was closed, and the case disappeared from Michigan court records. Meanwhile, the legend of the Benders continued to grow, especially with reports of ghosts and supernatural apparitions on the old property. Local residents began reporting glowing figures, whispers and moans coming from the abandoned land, fueling rumors that Kate Bender had returned to haunt the place where she had taken so many lives. Known as the Butcher, her name became synonymous with fear, and few dared to travel that road at night. Among all the bodies found, only those of Henry Mackenzie, William York, George Launcher and his daughter received a proper burial in Independence. The others were never claimed by family members and were buried at a site about 2 kilometers from the inn. Before the inn was completely destroyed by relic hunters, 3 hammers used in the murders were recovered from the property in 1967. These hammers were handed over to the Bender Museum by the son of Leroy Dick, the Osage County administrator who had led the searches on the property at the time. The objects were on display from 1967 until 1978, but over time, the townspeople began to oppose the idea of the town being remembered solely for the Bender murders. In the end, the hammers were relocated to the Cherryvale Museum, where they remain to this day. Even today, the origin of the Bender family remains a mystery. Were they 4 strangers who decided to create a new identity to cover up their crimes? Were they 2 outlaw couples who joined forces to kill and rob in a brutal and cunning manner? Or were they truly a bloodthirsty family, motivated both by fun and by money? In truth, it is very likely that the full story will never be known. But one fact remains. The Benders murdered more than 11 people and escaped justice, becoming the first and most legendary family of serial killers of the Old West.